FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz. Today is February 20th, 2017. Well, hey, we've got Frexit coming up. Well, maybe not Frexit, but we've got the French elections. Marine Le Pen is in the lead and widening her lead. Is this a potentially existential event for the euro? Well, John Rubino has his opinions on it. John, good morning and happy Monday.
Morning, Kerry. Yeah, the whole euro crisis thing is getting kind of repetitious, isn't it? You know, you go back a couple of years, there was one, and then before that, there was a one previous. And each time around, it looks like it's curtains for the euro. And what's happening now is that Marine Le Pen, who is a presidential candidate in France, who would like to leave the Eurozone and the EU and do basically a Brexit, but for France, is rising in the polls. She's going to get the most votes in the first round of voting coming up soon, and she's narrowing the gap with the front runner for the runoff that would decide who's the president. And as her poll numbers go up, French bonds go down. And now we're seeing the yield differential between French bonds and German bonds, which is a measure of how happy people are with the situation in France, basically. If France can borrow for the same amount as Germany, that means everybody's basically okay with what's going on in France. And when the spread widens out, that means they're not. And very recently, France and Germany could borrow money for basically the same amount or the same interest rate. Now that's changing. It's up to about 70 basis points. In other words, if Germany borrows for 0%, France has to pay 0.7%. And it's spiking. It's heading up from there, which implies that people are worried about what's happening in France and by extension, what's happening with the Eurozone. Because if France actually elected Marine Le Pen and she actually tried to pull France out of the Eurozone, that's curtains for the euro because France is central to the European project. You know, Britain is peripheral, but France is right there in the center, and the project can't go forward without their participation. So if France leaves the Eurozone, I mean, who's left? Is it going to be Germany and Italy? That's not a partnership that, as we found out from previous world wars, that's not a partnership that really is stable for very long. So this is a big deal, potentially, but we've been here before a couple of times. I've been going back through the archives at dollarcollapse.com to see what I wrote and what I was posting in previous years about the Eurozone. And a couple times in the past, usually because of Greece in the past, there have been these kinds of crises where everybody was saying, whoops, I don't think I want Spanish bonds anymore or Portuguese bonds. I'm going to load up on German debt because if the Eurozone were to break up, then Germany would be the lone AAA credit remaining in Europe and everybody else would be in various kinds of turmoil. So you get that kind of a spike in anxiety when one or another of the Eurozone countries look like they're getting into trouble. And now we've got France doing, a particularly dicey election here. We've got Italy with elections coming up where Five Star Movement, which is the Marine Le Pen analog in Italy, in other words, they'll take their country out of the Eurozone. If they win, they look like they're in danger of taking power. And you've got Greece, as usual, trying to engineer a bailout, being unable to do it because there's such a basket case financially and having everybody threaten them with expulsion from the Eurozone, et cetera, et cetera. So you got a lot of stuff going on in Europe, much of which is scary to the bond markets. Now, if the worst case scenario should happen, that's not just a European problem either, because the euro is a big deal in global currency markets. The Eurozone, or the European Union, is the single biggest economic entity in the world. And, everybody owns euro-denominated debt. Everybody owns euros out there in one way or another, either central bank reserves or personal investments. So this is a huge deal for the rest of the world if it comes to pass. Now, it has been here a couple of times in the past, as I said, and it hasn't blown up. But just because something hasn't gone that way in the past doesn't mean it will not in the future. We could see the Eurozone be thrown into turmoil this year by elections. And Marine Le Pen, though, she's not really favored yet, but neither was Trump. at this point in our election cycle. Neither was Brexit at this point in that cycle. So Marine Le Pen is no less likely or no more unlikely than Trump or Brexit, which means that we could get another nasty surprise from the point of view of the Eurozone and the global financial community in early summer, late spring in France. So it bears watching. And I think eventually the euro is toast because it has these fatal flaws from conception that have never been addressed and really aren't being addressed by the people in charge. Nigel Farage made a speech to the European Parliament the other day in response to some previous speakers saying that what people need in Europe is more Europe. In other words, they want to further integrate European countries into the European Union, basically make them subservient to a really unelected parliament that nobody even knows who is in, and that keeps producing more and more onerous regulations that are a big reason why the Eurozone economy isn't growing. Despite the fact that Germany is a pretty rock solid, fast growing economy, the rest of the European countries aren't. And so they're falling further and further behind. They're unable to pay their bills. They're taking on more and more debt. You've got a completely unsustainable trajectory here, which at some point blows up. So the question isn't whether it's going to blow up, it's whether this particular crisis is the thing that takes the Eurozone down. So yeah, it definitely bears watching, and it's a very big deal for US stocks and US bonds and the Chinese financial markets and pretty much everywhere else.
Yeah. So the Europeans, the average guy on the street, just like in the US, just like in Britain, they're just fed up with these pointy-headed bureaucrats who know better than you know how you should be bottling your water or how you should be wrapping your chocolate or, umpteen other regulations, right? Right, John? I mean, isn't that the case?
Well, yeah. In one sense, the European Union is trying to become the United States. In other words, a strong central government that sets basically budget priorities and runs foreign affairs and everything for all the member states who are basically subservient to the central government. The difference being the U.S. was set up on, at least initially, a libertarian perspective where the central government was supposed to have a few well-defined functions, and the states were supposed to handle most everything else, and over time, we've drifted away from that, obviously, where the central government has gotten more and more powerful. But still, states have a fair degree of autonomy in setting their own internal budgets and et cetera, et cetera. In Europe, you've got a central government that is getting more and more powerful all the time and basically controlling everything. The European Constitution is this book. The U.S. Constitution is a few pages, but the European Constitution is this trade paperback book that deals with everything that goes on in European countries. And because of that, the European economy is basically hamstrung. You don't have entrepreneurs doing much of anything that's interesting in Europe, and big businesses dominate. Europe, as I said before, is the biggest economic entity in the world, but where are the tech startups that are changing the world? They're all happening in Silicon Valley, or to a lesser extent, China. All the dynamism in the world has bypassed Europe. They're just these they've got these little tiny companies that can't do much of anything, and then these big behemoths that are just old style companies that really don't play major roles in much of the future oriented economic growth in the world. So the European project has failed in that sense. It's basically become a socialist dystopia in a lot of ways. And now people are starting to rebel against it. And so the Europeans, they don't know what to do because they don't want democracy. They don't want people to actually be able to choose whether to stay or leave the Eurozone and the European Union. But they don't want to just admit that they're a dictatorship either. And so they're kind of stuck in the middle between two really unpalatable choices. And it's fairly clear. There was one of the things that Nigel Farage talked about in his speech was that there was just a poll just lately where Europeans were asked about Muslim immigration. Do they want more of it? Do they want less, et cetera, et cetera? And the people in the European Parliament assumed that
they want more, of course.
Widespread immigration, was very popular. And it was just the right-wing populists who were stirring up all this trouble. But it turns out only 20% of Europeans wanted any more Muslim immigration. 80% of the people responding said they would like to just stop immigration from the Middle East, basically, in its tracks,
Yeah,
and so that was this huge shock, because that means Marine Le Pen's position is overwhelmingly popular. She's not a fringe candidate on that issue. She's in the mainstream. And so this terrifies these guys because they don't know what to do about it.
Which is why I believe she's going to win, because these polls, the thing is, the polls rely upon voluntary participation of the people being polled, and the polls are run by the gigundo news organizations, or they're sponsored by them, right? And when you lose faith in the gigundo news organizations, like here, AP, New York Times, Washington Post, etc., then the people aren't totally stupid. They understand that who's sponsoring these things, and then they just give them either wrong answers or they refuse to comply with them, and they just don't participate. And then you're left with faulty samples, and you're just you wind up with incorrect results. And I think that's what's going to happen here in France yet again. And the shock will be palatable, because the polls are also designed to help determine the outcome, not just predict it. And that's what people are wise to here, John. Don't you think?
Yeah. Kerry, your listeners should recall that back when everybody was saying, oh, Trump has a 5% chance of winning, et cetera, Clinton is a lock, and including me, you were there saying Trump is going to win. And your prediction turned out to be right. You had a handle on this. So when you say that Marine Le Pen is going to win, even though the polls say she probably won't right now, I tend to listen, because you were right last time around.
But I could definitely be wrong. I don't want to portray myself as some pundit with a stellar record, because I couldn't believe the country could elect Obama twice. But then again, look who he was running against. I mean, these people were just nauseating who he ran against. So yeah, I totally get why he was elected twice, even though I found him repugnant on so many levels that I couldn't even begin to explain, and nothing to do with who he was, just what he stood for. But I just see Le Pen as, look, they don't want more immigration, because the native populations, European populations, are feeling alienated in their own countries. When you have that social alienation, and then you see that the welfare programs to bring these immigrants in are bankrupting the countries, which they never talk about. The combination of the two, and then low to no or negative economic growth due to the ossification of the economic systems due to Brussels, the center of the EU, which Brussels is a meaningless little country that has way outsized power. A combination of all those things coming together, and the resentment of the 1% of the financial controllers of the world, 1/10 of 1%. It's a very potent mixture, of rocket fuel here that has. You've seen these elections here. You saw what was it in Italy as well that brought down the government there, and it's going to do the same thing here in France. I know they like their wine and their cheese and their great food, but even the French will be fed up and act to eventually protect, or act in a way that they believe that they're protecting their own interests. That's my thesis. I could be totally wrong. I've been wrong many times before. But I just see this as happening here, John.
Yeah. Well, the takeaway from this is that even if Beppe Grillo in Italy and Marine Le Pen in France and the populists in the Netherlands who have an election coming up, even if those guys don't win this time around, they will win next time around, because the status quo is unacceptable and becoming more so to most Europeans. So either you get somebody in there right away who's promising some kind of change. It could be, the things that the left and the right are promising are very different, but they both appeal to a fairly significant part of the dissatisfied population in these countries. So it could be Bernie Sanders coming in, or it could be Donald Trump, whatever, for each of these countries. But the fact is, somebody new who's going to tear down the existing system and replace it with something is going to be elected eventually in most of these countries, because the existing system isn't working. And it happens this year or next year or the year after. And we can't know about that for sure.
Correct.
But it's a fairly safe bet that, quote unquote, populism ends up being in charge of most of these countries one way or another. Mm-hmm. And what that means for the Eurozone and the EU is instability. What kind of instability remains to be seen. But I think it's a safe bet that 5 years from now, the Eurozone and to an extent the EU won't exist in their current forms. They may go the other way and become more centralized, essentially dictatorships, or they may break up and spin out of control and have all the countries go back to their old currencies. We can't know that because we don't know which side is going to win these elections, but it's, I think, a certainty that that kind of turmoil, the kind that affects the value of the euro and European stocks, and by implication, the financial markets in other countries, is coming with more or less speed here. We don't know how fast it's going to happen. We don't know exactly when or exactly what form it's going to take, but it's certainly going to come. And when it does, gold and silver are the beneficiaries. It's hard to know what it means for instance, U.S. stocks, because uncertainty over there might mean terrified capital flowing in and pushing up U.S. stocks, or it might mean U.S. stocks being perceived as overvalued in an unstable world and crashing. We can't know that. But gold and silver should do well no matter how it plays out, because uncertainty is good for older forms of money that governments can't create in unlimited quantities, which is what gold and silver are.
Yeah.
So I think that's the only winner, the only surefire winner. There will be lots of winners and losers, but the only one that we can point to with certainty is precious metals.
Yeah. Yeah, we know that. Eventually, the old becomes new again. And look, we've seen this over and over and over again throughout history. What we haven't seen is the suppression of it and the way that the elites have really grabbed control of the system and held onto it for so long. It's like when you're fishing and you get that fish and you reel it in and then it goes out again, and you reel it in and it goes out and in and out and in and out. And it's remarkable how long you can do this for. And that's what they've done. And hey, I'm shocked by it. It's been 6 years here. They've been doing it, but they've done it, John. Don't you find that amazing?
It's been 40 years, really, since 1971. When we took the world off the remnants of the gold standard, we handed an unlimited credit card to the 1%, in effect. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that the banks have gotten bigger and more powerful, and they've come to control the economy, and vast amounts of wealth have been flowing out of the bank accounts of regular people and into the portfolios
Pockets.
of the rich. Yeah. And people are finally figuring this out. It took quite a while, because for instance, in the U.S., both the major parties like the system as it is because they benefit from it. The Democrats are the technocrats, the well-educated people who tend to make out in a globalist system and have seen their incomes rise year after year after year. So they're loving this, and the Republicans are the owners of capital as a general rule, which has won out in relation to labor over the past 30, 40 years. So they're loving it too, so they like free immigration because that's cheap nannies and cheap factory workers. And they love free trade because that raises the value of what they're selling on global markets, but it leaves everybody else behind. And finally, the 90% or so of people in the country who are more or less left behind by this are starting to rebel, which makes this a really interesting, terrifying time, because we don't know the form of the rebellion and we don't know the response of the 1%. So we don't know whether we get a military coup here coming up or a socialist utopia trying to be imposed on us. We just don't know how it's going to play out. But we definitely are going to see turmoil going forward. And it's according to the script, you mess up your finances, you by implication mess up your politics, which in turn messes up your finances even further. So we've got this feedback loop going here that shows no sign of slowing down.
Yeah. Well, I've said from the get-go, when you look at Trump, all these programs, his policies that he'd like to implement, some of them might be quite good, others maybe not so good, but it's not how history's going to judge him, because history's going to judge him based on his response to the crises that envelop the country and the world, not based upon what happens or if he managed to shut off the flow of illegal aliens or if he brought more jobs to the country. It's not the way it's going to be. That's been my opinion for some time. They talk about the fourth turning. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if it really exists. I just don't know. I'm not smart enough to figure that out. But what I do know is that we've talked about these upcoming disasters till we're blue in the face, but they are going to come. And I don't think anything can stop it. I'm not sure that the central banks are deliberately trying to bring them upon us, but I think whether they're trying to stop them or make them happen, they're going to happen, John, right? Can anything stop them?
Well, nothing is going to stop rising instability, but the form it's going to take, who knows? Yeah, I don't know what these guys are going to do, because so much of this stuff, there are broad forces at work with debt rising every year, which leads to a few fairly predictable things. But which of that set of predictable things we're going to end up with is anybody's guess, because it depends on people sitting around conference tables under huge amounts of pressure, making decisions with insufficient information. That's our world going forward. I mean, it's always our world, but more so now than ever in the past. So Carrie, I don't know. I expect crazy stuff to happen, but the form of the crazy stuff, for instance, as you were saying, the central banks of the world might start bumping heads with the governments of the world. If we see interest rates going up, for instance, if Yellen raises rates by 50 basis points next time around, what's Trump going to do if he wants a weaker dollar? And a 50 basis point bump in short-term interest rates gives us a stronger dollar. Are we going to see civil war between elected leaders and central bank bureaucrats? Who knows? It's all out there waiting to happen. And it's going to be great theater, but absolutely terrifying from the point of view of anybody who depends on the current financial system.
Yep. That's a good point. And I guess we'll leave it at that. So go check out John's work over at dollarcollapse.com. Any questions, comments about this interview or others, email us at kl@kerrylutz.com, kl@kerrylutz.com. The Twitter feed is at Kerry Lutz. The Facebook page is Financial Survival Network. Hey, my new book is out, Viral Podcasting. If you have any interest in podcasting or internet radio, it's definitely must reading. You can find the link on Financial Survival Network, and also it's over at Amazon.com. Just search Viral Podcasting. John, we will talk to you next week. Be well.
Great. Thanks, Kerry. You too.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next. FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz. Today is February 20th, 2017. Well, hey, we've got Frexit coming up. Well, maybe not Frexit, but we've got...
by extension, what's happening with the Eurozone. Because if France actually elected Marine Le Pen, and she actually tried to pull France out of the Eurozone, that's curtains for the Euro, because France is central to the European project. Britain is peripheral, but France is right there in the center, and the project can't go forward without their participation. So if France leaves the Eurozone, I mean, who's left? Is it going to be Germany and Italy? That's not a partnership that, as we found out from previous world wars, that's not a partnership that really is stable.
The French elections, Marine Le Pen is in the lead and widening her lead. Is this a potentially existential event for the Euro? Well, John Rubino has his opinions on it. John, good morning and happy Monday.
Morning, Kerry. Yeah, the whole Euro crisis thing is getting kind of repetitious, isn't it? You go back a couple of years, there was one, and then before that, there was a one previous, and each time around, it looks like it's curtains for the Euro. And what's happening now is that Marine Le Pen situation in France, basically. If France can borrow for the same amount as Germany, that means everybody's basically okay with what's going on in France. And when the spread widens out, that means they're not. And very recently, France and Germany could borrow money for basically the same amount or the same interest rate. Now that's changing. It's up to about 70 basis points. In other words, if Germany borrows for 0%, France has to pay 0.7%. And it's spiking. It's heading up from there, which implies that people are worried about what's happening in France. And Biden, who is a presidential candidate in France, who would like to leave the Eurozone and the EU and do basically a Brexit, but for France, is rising in the polls. She's going to get the most votes in the first round of voting coming up soon, and she's narrowing the gap with the front runner for the runoff that would decide who's the president. And as her poll numbers go up, French bonds go down. And now we're seeing the yield differential between French bonds and German bonds, which is a measure of how happy people are with the situation.